The ballroom of the Blackmore estate was illuminated by precisely 3,412 wax candles, casting a suffocatingly golden glow over the 318 guests who moved across the marble floor in a synchronized, meticulously calculated display of aristocratic opulence. Duke Alexander Blackmore stood near the grand archway, his posture immaculately rigid at a perfect 90-degree angle, observing the swirling mass of silk and velvet with eyes that calculated the precise socio-economic value of every individual in the room within mere fractions of a second. He was a man composed entirely of cold, impenetrable logic, his heart seemingly beating at a steady, unchanging 62 beats per minute, regardless of the emotional chaos surrounding him. He wore a midnight blue velvet coat adorned with 47 silver threads per square inch, a garment that projected an aura of absolute authority and demanded the unspoken submission of every lord and lady who dared to breathe the air within a 50-foot radius of his person. His gaze swept over the crowd, registering the microscopic twitches of ambition in the lips of the minor barons, the 14 distinct signs of financial desperation in the forced laughter of a neighboring earl, and the 32 degrees of artificial warmth in the greetings exchanged between rival matriarchs. To Alexander, this ball was not a celebration of the autumn equinox, but a rigorous battlefield where every step, every sip of champagne, and every fleeting glance was a weapon to be utilized or neutralized. Standing exactly 3 paces behind him was Thomas, his elderly butler, a man who had served the Blackmore family for 46 years, 7 months, and 12 days. Thomas was a silent monolith of loyalty, his deep-set eyes missing nothing, his mind a fortified vault containing the darkest and most ancient secrets of the Blackmore lineage. It was precisely at 22 minutes past 9 o'clock that the atmosphere in the room shifted by an imperceptible fraction, a disturbance measured only in the subtle tightening of Alexander's jaw muscles. A maid, designated by the household ledger as Clara, was navigating the treacherous perimeter of the dance floor, her hands gripping the edges of a silver tray, holding exactly 12 crystal flutes of imported crimson wine. Clara was a creature of enduring empathy and invisible labor, her presence barely registering as human to the upper echelons of society. She possessed a quiet, resilient grace, having survived 24 years of relentless hardship, yet she walked with a step that betrayed a slight, almost unnoticeable hesitation, the result of carrying the weight of an agonizing past that she kept hidden beneath the starched, immaculate white cotton of her uniform. Her heart raced at 112 beats per minute as she calculated the trajectory needed to bypass the expanding skirt of a dowager duchess, her focus so absolute on the precarious balance of the tray that she failed to register the sudden, erratic backward step of a drunken viscount. The collision was inevitable, occurring in a span of 0.3 of a second. The Viscount's elbow struck Clara's left shoulder with a force that destabilized her center of gravity by a fatal 15 degrees. The silver tray tilted, and despite her desperate, microsecond attempt to correct the angle, exactly 4 of the crystal flutes toppled, sending a torrent of precisely 14 ounces of dark, staining wine directly toward the immaculately polished leather of the Duke's left boot. The liquid splashed in an irregular, chaotic pattern, leaving 47 distinct droplets of crimson upon the flawless black surface, a catastrophic violation of the Duke's immaculate presentation. Silence descended upon the immediate vicinity in exactly 2 seconds, the music of the string quartet seeming to fade into an irrelevant background noise as the surrounding aristocrats turned their predatory gazes toward the disaster. Clara dropped to her knees instantly, her breath catching in her throat as she scrambled to pull a linen cloth from her apron, her hands trembling at a frequency that made it nearly impossible to grasp the fabric. She kept her head bowed, her vision restricted to the terrifying expanse of the Duke's ruined boots, knowing with absolute certainty that she had just committed an unforgivable transgression in a world governed by unforgiving rules. Alexander looked down at her, his expression devoid of any recognizable human emotion, his calculating mind already dismantling her entire existence. He did not shout. Instead, he allowed exactly 14 seconds of agonizing silence to stretch between them, a psychological torture designed to break her spirit before he even uttered a single syllable. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant baritone that carried a lethal precision, perfectly modulated to reach the ears of exactly 24 surrounding guests. He stated with chilling articulation that she was a profound manifestation of incompetence, a creature so fundamentally flawed in her spatial awareness and basic motor functions that she insulted the very concept of service. He systematically deconstructed her worth, analyzing the pathetic trembling of her hands, the cheap, coarse texture of her hair, and the utter insignificance of her lineage, reducing her to a statistical error in the grand equation of his household. He told her, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly intimate 30 decibels, that she was to leave his sight immediately, forfeit her wages for the past 3 months, and never allow her shadow to desecrate the grounds of his estate again. The surrounding lords and ladies responded with a chorus of precisely timed, cruel titters, their amusement fueled by the destruction of a lesser being. Clara absorbed every word like a physical blow, her jaw locking as she fought the biological urge to weep, forcing the moisture to remain trapped within her tear ducts through sheer, agonizing willpower. She murmured a fractured, barely audible apology, her voice trembling but unbroken, and began to gather the shattered remnants of the crystal flutes, cutting her index finger in the process and leaving a single minuscule drop of her own blood on the marble. As she moved to stand, the sheer panic and the physical strain caused her right arm to jerk awkwardly, catching the coarse fabric of her long sleeve on the jagged edge of the fallen silver tray. With a sickening sound of tearing threads, the seam of the sleeve ripped upward by exactly 5.5 inches, exposing the pale skin of her right forearm to the harsh, unforgiving light of the 3,000 candles. There, etched into the flesh with brutal permanence, was a scar. It was a terrible, jagged mark, exactly 7.3 inches in length, winding like a twisted serpent from her wrist toward her elbow, its edges carrying the distinct, unmistakable texture of a severe, ancient burn mingled with a deep laceration. Clara gasped, her left hand instantly flying to cover the exposed disfigurement, a reflex honed by years of concealing her deepest shame. But the action was precisely 1.5 seconds too late. The Duke's eyes, trained to capture and analyze every visual anomaly, locked onto the scar, his brain registering its exact dimensions and characteristics, though his conscious mind had not yet processed its significance. But Thomas, standing silently in the periphery, saw it. The elderly butler's eyes widened by a fraction of a millimeter, his breath hitching in his chest as his heart skipped a single, terrifying beat. The rigid posture he had maintained for 46 years suddenly faltered, his shoulders dropping by 1/4 of an inch as a tidal wave of suppressed memories from exactly 20 years, 4 months, and 9 days ago crashed into his consciousness. He saw the fire. He smelled the ash. He remembered the screaming, the collapsing beams, and the small, fragile child who had been pulled from the inferno, her arm torn and burned by a falling iron chandelier as she threw herself over the 4-year-old heir to the Blackmore fortune. Thomas knew that scar. It was not a random disfigurement. It was the sacred defining mark of the true, long-lost heiress of the rival house of Sterling, the very child who had inexplicably vanished into the chaotic aftermath of the blaze, the child who had traded her flesh to save the life of the cold, arrogant Duke who now stood before her, actively destroying her life. Clara, oblivious to the monumental revelation occurring in the mind of the butler, managed to stand, her posture broken, her dignity stripped away. She turned precisely 180 degrees, her movements stiff and mechanical, and began the long, agonizing walk of 52 paces toward the servants' exit, the cruel laughter of the aristocracy trailing behind her like a poisonous fog. Alexander watched her retreat, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting data, the image of that jagged, violent scar searing itself into his visual cortex with a tenacity he could not mathematically explain. He adjusted his cuff, an involuntary motion designed to reassert control, and turned to instruct Thomas to summon the head housekeeper to manage the remaining cleanup. But as he looked at his oldest confidant, Alexander froze. For the first time in 10,840 days of their acquaintance, Thomas's face was completely drained of color. His skin a pallid, ashen gray, his hands trembling with an intensity that caused his white gloves to vibrate. The Duke's analytical mind immediately registered the physiological signs of profound shock in the butler, a reaction completely disproportionate to a spilled glass of wine. Alexander's voice, usually a weapon of absolute command, softened into a sharp, demanding whisper, asking Thomas what optical or psychological anomaly had just occurred to cause such a severe deviation from his baseline composure. Thomas did not respond immediately. He took precisely 3 seconds to gather his fragmented thoughts, his eyes remaining fixed on the empty space where Clara had stood, before he leaned forward, closing the distance between himself and the Duke to a highly unorthodox 12 inches. In a voice so quiet it barely registered above the ambient noise of the ballroom, a mere 15 decibels of pure historical dread, Thomas informed the Duke that the mathematical probability of what he had just witnessed was infinitesimally small, yet absolutely certain. He spoke without formal titles, the gravity of the situation stripping away decades of protocol, and stated with chilling clarity that the maid whose life the Duke had just systematically destroyed was the ghost of the Sterling fire. He described the scar, matching its exact length, its jagged trajectory, and its dual nature of burn and laceration to the precise medical reports buried in the Blackmore archives for 2 decades. The words hit Alexander with the physical force of a heavy, blunt instrument, disrupting his perfect internal equilibrium and causing his heart rate to spike from a steady 62 to a chaotic 140 beats per minute in a matter of 2 seconds. The entire foundation of his logical, ordered universe began to fracture, the air in the ballroom suddenly feeling 60% less oxygenated as the horrifying reality of his own cruelty merged with the monumental revelation of the girl's true identity. The immediate aftermath of Thomas's revelation suspended Duke Alexander Blackmore in a state of psychological paralysis that lasted exactly 7.8 seconds, an eternity for a mind accustomed to processing complex strategic decisions in fractions of a moment. His peripheral vision blurred, narrowing his focus exclusively to the rapidly receding figure of Clara, who was now 32 paces away, her torn sleeve clutched desperately against her body. The aristocratic chatter of the 318 guests surrounding him devolved into a meaningless, atonal drone, a stark contrast to the deafening roar of 20-year-old memories reigniting within his own consciousness. The fire, the heat measuring hundreds of degrees, the falling timber. He had been 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days old, suffocating in a nursery filled with toxic smoke, when a girl, no older than 6, had breached the burning threshold. He possessed only fragmented sensory data from that night, the smell of burning cedar, the agonizing heat on his face, and the desperate, agonizing scream of the girl as the iron chandelier, weighing exactly 85 pounds, had collapsed, its jagged edge tearing into her forearm as she threw herself over his small body, shielding him from a lethal impact. For 2 decades, his entire existence, his immense fortune, and his absolute authority had been built upon the foundation of that sacrifice, a debt calculated at infinite value, owed to a phantom child who was presumed to have perished in the ashes of the Sterling estate. And now, the irrefutable proof of her survival, the living embodiment of his salvation, had just been subjected to a meticulously executed public execution by his own command. A wave of nausea, a physiological response he had not experienced in 14 years, gripped his stomach as the horrific magnitude of his actions crystallized. He had called her incompetent. He had reduced her humanity to a statistical error. He had banished the true heiress of the Sterling fortune, the savior of the Blackmore bloodline, into the unforgiving cold of the London streets. Without a single word of explanation to the bewildered aristocrats who still awaited his next display of dominance, Alexander pivoted on his heel, his highly polished boots slipping precisely 2 millimeters on the spilled wine as he abandoned his rigid posture and began to move. His stride was long, aggressive, covering 48 inches per step, a pace that shattered the carefully curated illusion of unhurried aristocratic grace. He ignored the 72 inquiring glances and the 14 whispered questions that trailed in his wake, his entire being consumed by a singular obsessive directive. He had to stop her. He navigated the complex architecture of his estate with predatory efficiency, bypassing the grand staircase in favor of the narrow, dimly lit servants' corridors, a labyrinth he had not traversed since his childhood. He counted his steps, his mind relying on numbers to stave off the encroaching panic. 112 steps down the west corridor, 34 steps past the kitchens, 17 steps to the rear exit. He burst through the heavy oak door leading to the cobblestone alleyway, exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds after Clara had fled the ballroom, the cold autumn air, measuring 45 degrees Fahrenheit, hitting his face like a physical blow. He scanned the damp, fog-choked alley, his eyes adjusting to the darkness in exactly 4 seconds. There were 3 distinct sets of footprints in the thin layer of mud, but the alley was empty. She was gone. She had evaporated into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the city. Alexander stood frozen beneath the flickering light of a single gas lamp, the silence of the alley amplifying the chaotic, deafening rhythm of his own pulse. For the first time in his meticulously orchestrated life, he experienced the terrifying sensation of absolute helplessness. He turned back toward the estate, his mind instantly initiating a rigorous, unyielding protocol. He would find her. The probability of failure was mathematically unacceptable. He re-entered the manor and summoned Thomas to his private study, a room fortified with oak panels 3 inches thick, ensuring total acoustic isolation. Over the next 63 hours, the Duke of Blackmore did not sleep, his body fueled by exactly 14 cups of black coffee and a terrifying, obsessive guilt that bordered on madness. He transformed his study into a war room, covering his expansive mahogany desk with exactly 241 documents pulled from the deepest archives of the estate and the city's municipal records. He demanded the complete ledgers of the household staff, cross-referencing Clara's employment history with the orphanages and workhouses of the eastern districts. He calculated the exact trajectory of her life since the fire, a morbid mathematical reconstruction of a stolen existence. Thomas, working alongside him with a silent, unwavering dedication, revealed the darkest fragments of the Sterling family history. He explained, his voice maintaining a steady, objective tone despite the horrific content, that following the devastating fire that claimed the lives of Clara's parents, her uncle and aunt, Lord and Lady Harrington, had assumed control of the surviving estate. They had declared the young heiress dead just 48 hours after the blaze, a timeline that Alexander's analytical mind immediately recognized as suspicious. They had systematically embezzled her entire inheritance, a sum totaling precisely £4,250,000, funneling the wealth into offshore accounts and failing enterprises, leaving Clara to vanish into the brutal, anonymous machinery of the lower classes. Alexander absorbed this data, his cold, calculating persona returning, but it was no longer fueled by arrogance. It was weaponized by a lethal, protective rage. He meticulously mapped out the Harringtons' current financial vulnerabilities, identifying exactly 14 points of critical weakness in their investments, their social standing, and their legal protections. He was not merely going to find Clara, he was going to systematically annihilate the individuals who had stolen her destiny. He mobilized a network of 32 private investigators, offering bounties that exceeded the annual salary of a high-ranking government official, effectively flooding the city with eyes searching for a woman with a jagged 7-inch scar on her right arm. On the third day, at exactly 14 minutes past 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a breakthrough arrived. An operative reported a sighting in the impoverished district of Spitalfields, detailing a woman matching Clara's exact physical parameters, working a grueling 14-hour shift in a textile mill, her hands bleeding as she operated a loom. Alexander did not send an emissary. He did not dispatch Thomas. He stood up, his muscles aching with the accumulated fatigue of 3 sleepless nights, adjusted his cravat with mechanical precision, and ordered his carriage. The journey to Spitalfields took precisely 41 minutes, a descent from the pinnacle of aristocratic wealth into a hellscape of industrial despair. The air was thick with coal smoke, reducing visibility to a mere 20 feet, and the rhythmic, deafening clatter of the mills created a soundscape of unyielding misery. Alexander stepped out of the carriage, his immaculate attire contrasting violently with the grime-covered cobblestones, and walked exactly 62 paces to the entrance of the mill. He bypassed the foreman, silencing the man's protests with a single, terrifying look and a handful of precisely folded 50-pound notes, and stepped into the cavernous, sweltering interior. There were 142 workers in the room, but his eyes locked onto her instantly. Clara was stationed at a machine in the far corner, her movements repetitive, exhausted, and tragically graceful. Her ripped sleeve had been replaced by a coarse, ill-fitting wool garment, but the memory of the scar burned in his mind. He approached her slowly, his steps measured, closing the distance of 50 feet in exactly 30 seconds. When he was merely 3 feet away, he stopped, the proximity allowing him to see the precise details of her exhaustion. The dark circles beneath her eyes, the fine layer of soot on her cheek, the micro-tremors in her hands as she worked the threads. Clara, sensing the shift in the air, stopped her machine and turned. When she saw him, her eyes widened by a fraction, her body instinctively retreating a single step, a defensive maneuver against the man who had verbally destroyed her just days prior. She waited in silence, anticipating a continuation of his cruelty, her posture braced for impact. Alexander looked at her, his meticulously constructed walls of logic and arrogance completely crumbling in the face of her quiet endurance. He did not issue a command. He did not assert his dominance. Instead, he slowly removed his right glove, a gesture that took exactly 4 seconds, his eyes never leaving hers. In a voice stripped of all its former terrifying baritone, replaced by a quiet, raw sincerity measuring barely 20 decibels, he spoke her true name, a name that had not been spoken aloud in 20 years. He called her Eleanor Sterling. Clara's breath hitched, her mind unable to process the data, assuming it to be a cruel, psychological game. She shook her head slightly, a movement of exactly 2 inches, and whispered that he was mistaken, that she was merely Clara, a dismissed maid with no surname and no history. But Alexander stepped closer, bridging the final gap between them, and with a reverence that defied every rule of his existence, he gently reached out and took her right hand, his thumb resting softly over the coarse fabric that hid her scar, and told her that he knew exactly who she was, what she had sacrificed, and that he had come to return everything that had been stolen from her. The interaction between Duke Alexander Blackmore and Clara, now undeniably recognized as Eleanor Sterling, within the suffocating 92-degree heat of the textile mill, lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, but the psychological impact of that span redefined the trajectory of both their lives. Clara stood paralyzed, her heart rate accelerating to a dangerous 130 beats per minute as her mind desperately attempted to process the impossibility of the situation. The man who had, a mere 84 hours ago, utilized his immense vocabulary and absolute authority to annihilate her dignity in front of 318 members of the aristocracy, was now standing amidst the deafening machinery of Spitalfields, touching her hand with a gentleness that contradicted every established parameter of his character. She looked at his thumb resting over her hidden scar, a micro-expression of profound confusion and deep-seated terror flashing across her features for exactly 0.3 of a second. She attempted to withdraw her hand, a reflexive motion to protect her vulnerabilities, but Alexander maintained his grip, his hold firm enough to prevent her retreat, yet careful enough not to exert more than a few ounces of pressure. He spoke again, his voice maintaining its low, urgent frequency of 20 decibels, slicing through the industrial noise with absolute clarity. He explained, using precise, undeniable facts, the events of the fire 20 years ago, detailing the exact location of the nursery, the 85-pound weight of the iron chandelier, and the specific trajectory of her laceration, data that only the child who had been there could possibly verify. As he relayed these mathematical proofs of her identity, Clara felt the architectural foundation of her repressed memories begin to violently fracture. The smell of burning cedar, a sensory detail she had forced her brain to ignore for over 7,000 days, suddenly overwhelmed her olfactory receptors, mingling with the harsh scent of the mill's machine oil. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, inhaling only 40% of her normal lung capacity as the reality of her stolen life crashed into her consciousness. Alexander, instantly reading the physiological markers of an impending panic attack, stepped seamlessly into her personal space, shielding her from the curious, exhausted stares of the surrounding 141 mill workers. He stated, with an absolute, unwavering certainty that left no room for debate, that her tenure of suffering was mathematically and fundamentally terminated at this exact moment. He did not ask for her permission. He simply assumed command of her safety, a reversion to his authoritative baseline, but weaponized for her protection rather than her destruction. He escorted her out of the mill in precisely 45 seconds, ignoring the factory foreman who attempted to intervene, neutralizing the man with a single glacial glare that communicated a threat of complete financial ruin. Within 2 minutes, Clara was seated inside the luxurious, velvet-lined interior of the Duke's carriage, her coarse, soot-stained garments staining the immaculate upholstery, a contrast that Alexander ignored completely. As the carriage began its 41-minute journey back to the Blackmore estate, an agonizing silence settled between them, lasting exactly 12 minutes. Alexander utilized this time to observe her, his mind calculating the immense psychological damage inflicted upon her by 2 decades of extreme poverty, while simultaneously mapping out the intricate, devastating warfare he was about to unleash upon her uncle and aunt, the Harringtons. The plan required precision, a series of calculated strikes designed to dismantle their empire without allowing them a single avenue of retreat. When Clara finally spoke, Her voice was a fragile whisper, asking him why he was doing this, why the architect of her most recent humiliation was suddenly acting as her savior. Alexander looked at her, his icy facade cracking to reveal a terrifying depth of guilt, and confessed that his entire empire was built upon the 85-pound weight she had taken upon her own flesh. He admitted his cruelty at the ball, a failure of logic and humanity that he quantified as the single greatest error of his existence, and vowed that he would spend every remaining second of his life rectifying it. Upon their arrival at the estate, Alexander bypassed standard protocol, terrifying the household staff by personally escorting the former maid through the grand entrance, walking her directly up the primary mahogany staircase. He installed her in the estate's most secure suite, a room featuring walls 2 feet thick and a reinforced oak door, assigning Thomas as her absolute guardian. Over the next 14 days, Alexander initiated his psychological and financial siege against the Harrington family. He operated with the ruthless efficiency of a highly sophisticated algorithm, executing 37 separate financial maneuvers that systematically isolated the Harringtons from their assets. He bought the debts of Lord Harrington, a sum totaling precisely £182,000, and called them in simultaneously at exactly 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. He manipulated the stock market, devaluing the Harringtons' primary maritime investments by 64% in a matter of 3 days through carefully planted rumors and strategic sell-offs. He intercepted 11 key shipments of their imported goods, utilizing his vast network to delay them at customs, choking their cash flow to absolute zero. Meanwhile, within the fortified walls of the Blackmore estate, Clara began a grueling psychological metamorphosis. She was surrounded by a team of 6 elite tailors, 3 etiquette instructors, and 2 medical professionals tasked with treating the residual trauma of her scar, yet she resisted the rapid assimilation into the aristocracy. Her empathy, forged in the fires of extreme hardship, clashed violently with the cold mathematical rules of the society she was being prepared to re-enter. She spent exactly 3 hours every afternoon in the Duke's private study, an unprecedented breach of his solitary sanctuary where they engaged in intense, complex dialogues. Alexander attempted to teach her the strategies of socio-political dominance, explaining the exact psychological leverage required to manipulate a room of 300 people, while Clara, in turn, dismantled his cynical worldview. She pointed out, with a quiet, devastating logic, that true power was not found in the calculated destruction of others, but in the resilient, enduring act of survival, referencing the specific struggles of the factory workers he viewed merely as statistics. She forced him to acknowledge that his rigid 90-degree posture and 62 beat-per-minute heart rate were not signs of strength, but elaborate defense mechanisms designed to protect a man terrified of uncontrollable human emotion. These daily interactions, averaging 180 minutes each, became a battleground of ideologies, slowly breaking down the Duke's impenetrable exterior. He found himself tracking her micro-expressions, not for signs of weakness, but for validation, his heart rate inexplicably spiking to 88 beats per minute whenever she smiled. A small, genuine expression that utilized precisely 12 facial muscles. He realized with a terrifying clarity that defied all mathematical models that his obsession with returning her birthright had mutated into a profound, consuming devotion. But the Harringtons, cornered and facing absolute annihilation, were not passive participants in their destruction. On the 14th day of the siege, calculating that their only remaining leverage was the elimination of the threat, Lord Harrington deployed a desperate, violent countermeasure. He hired 4 mercenaries, professionals from the criminal underworld, paying them exactly £2,000 each to breach the Blackmore estate, and silence the ghost of Eleanor Sterling before she could publicly reclaim her identity. Alexander, anticipating a chaotic response but underestimating the exact timeline of their desperation by 24 hours, was away at a parliament session, calculating the final legislative strike against the Harringtons' remaining political allies. At precisely 11 minutes past midnight, the temperature dropping to a freezing 38 degrees, the mercenaries bypassed the outer perimeter, neutralizing 2 guards with silent chemical sedatives, and began their ascent toward Clara's fortified suite, initiating a sequence of events that would force the Duke to abandon logic entirely and rely purely on the violent, unpredictable nature of survival. The breach of the Blackmore estate by the 4 mercenaries occurred with a terrifying, silent precision, a violent anomaly in an environment usually governed by absolute order. They navigated the complex interior architecture, covering 180 feet of marble hallway in exactly 2 minutes and 14 seconds, their footsteps muffled by specialized leather soles. They arrived at the reinforced oak door of Clara's suite at precisely 13 minutes past midnight. Thomas, who had maintained his vigil outside the room for exactly 336 consecutive hours, resting only in microcycles of 15 minutes, detected the subtle shift in air pressure and the faint, almost imperceptible sound of a metallic tool engaging with the heavy brass lock. The 70-year-old butler, armed only with a heavy silver candelabra weighing exactly 8 pounds, did not hesitate. He calculated the trajectory of the first mercenary stepping through the doorway and swung the heavy silver base in a brutal arc, connecting with the intruder's temple with a force that shattered bone and instantly incapacitated him. However, the element of surprise was consumed in that single violent fraction of a second. The second mercenary lunged, driving a heavily gloved fist into Thomas's ribs, cracking 3 of them with a sickening snap that echoed in the silent corridor, dropping the elderly man to the floor. Inside the suite, Clara, whose senses had been hyper-tuned by years of surviving the dangerous streets of Spitalfields, awoke precisely 1.2 seconds after the first impact. She did not scream. Screaming wasted oxygen and provided target coordinates. She rolled silently off the massive canopy bed, calculating the distance to the heavy iron fireplace poker, exactly 12 feet, and the time required to reach it. The door burst open, splintering the reinforced oak frame, and the remaining 3 mercenaries entered the room, their eyes scanning the darkness. Across the city, Duke Alexander Blackmore sat in his carriage, returning from Parliament. A sudden, inexplicable spike in his pulse, leaping from his baseline 62 to a chaotic 112 beats per minute, triggered an acute adrenaline dump into his system. He possessed no logical data indicating an attack, yet a primal, terrifying instinct overrode his analytical mind. He shouted a command to his driver, a violent demand measuring 90 decibels, ordering him to push the 4 horses to their absolute physical limits. The carriage tore through the cobblestone streets, cutting the standard 30-minute journey down to a reckless, terrifying 14 minutes, the wooden wheels skidding violently around sharp corners. Back in the suite, Clara fought with the desperate, feral intensity of a woman who had already survived the flames of hell. She gripped the iron poker, her hands sweating, and swung it at the legs of the closest attacker, striking his knee with a calculated, crushing force that dropped him instantly. But the third man, much larger, grabbed the iron rod, yanking it from her grasp and throwing her violently against the stone mantel. The impact concussed her, blurring her vision and causing a piercing tone to ring in her ears, her equilibrium instantly failing. As the mercenary drew a 6-inch blade, preparing to execute the final, lethal command, the heavy oak door was violently kicked off its remaining hinges, the wood splintering into 100 jagged fragments. Alexander Blackmore stood in the threshold, his normally immaculate attire disheveled, his eyes devoid of logic, replaced entirely by a terrifying, lethal rage. He did not analyze the situation. He executed a sequence of absolute violence. He crossed the 20 feet of the room in exactly 2.8 seconds. He bypassed the first rising mercenary, driving his knee into the man's sternum with enough kinetic energy to crack his ribcage, and lunged directly at the man standing over Clara. Alexander grabbed the mercenary's arm just 3 inches before the blade could descend, twisting the wrist with a brutal mathematical precision until the joint snapped in 2 distinct places. He then delivered a devastating 70-pound impact to the man's jaw, rendering him unconscious before his body even hit the floor. The entire engagement lasted exactly 19 seconds. Silence slammed back into the room, broken only by the ragged, desperate breathing of the Duke and the injured. Alexander fell to his knees beside Clara, his hands trembling, a physiological anomaly he had not permitted himself in 2 decades, as he rapidly assessed her injuries. He found a laceration on her forehead measuring 2 inches, and a severe contusion forming on her shoulder, but she was alive. Her pulse fluttered erratically beneath his fingertips, and as her vision cleared, she saw the cold, calculating Duke completely unraveled. His eyes locked onto her with a desperate, consuming panic. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her with a force that defied all rules of aristocratic decorum, whispering a frantic, repetitive vow that he would burn the entire city to ash before he let anyone harm her again. Exactly 48 hours later, the grand ballroom of the Blackmore estate was once again illuminated by 3,412 wax candles. The same 318 guests who had witnessed the maid's humiliation 2 weeks prior had been summoned under the guise of an urgent, mandatory assembly. The atmosphere was thick with anxiety, the room completely devoid of music, the silence absolute and suffocating. Alexander stood at the top of the grand marble staircase, his posture perfectly rigid once again, but his aura was no longer one of cold calculation. It was an aura of absolute, terrifying dominion. The Harringtons stood near the front of the crowd, their faces pale, their financial empire completely eradicated by Alexander's invisible war, existing merely as empty shells awaiting their final execution. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy oak doors at the top of the staircase opened, the collective breath of the aristocracy caught in their throats as a woman stepped forward. She was dressed not in the coarse cotton of a servant, but in a gown of midnight blue silk, embroidered with exactly 142 silver threads, echoing the Duke's own attire. Her posture was flawless, her movements graceful, yet she carried a quiet, undeniable strength that silenced the entire room. It was Clara, but the illusion of the maid was gone. As she descended the first 3 steps, she deliberately reached up and unbuttoned the long cuff of her right sleeve, folding the fabric back exactly 4 inches. The terrible, jagged 7-inch scar was exposed to the light of the 3,000 candles, no longer a mark of shame, but a triumphant banner of survival. Alexander stepped forward, taking her hand in front of the entire assembly, his eyes locking onto the Harringtons. In a voice that echoed with the force of an avalanche, he systematically dismantled their lies, recounting the precise timeline of their embezzlement, the exact weight of the chandelier that had scarred her, and the undeniable truth of her bloodline. He declared her with absolute legal and social finality as Eleanor Sterling, the sole legitimate heiress to the Sterling fortune. He watched the Harringtons crumble, their societal destruction complete in exactly 45 seconds, as the surrounding aristocrats instinctively recoiled from them. But Alexander was not finished. He turned to Eleanor, the cold, impenetrable Duke, kneeling before 300 people, a gesture that shattered every rule of his existence. He looked up at her, his heart beating at a steady, perfectly synchronized rhythm with hers. and presented a ring containing a flawless 4-carat diamond. He did not issue a command, he made a request, his voice dropping to an intimate 20 decibels, asking the woman who had saved his life 20 years ago and saved his soul 2 weeks ago to accept the title of Duchess of Blackmore. Eleanor looked down at the man who had been her tormentor, her savior, and ultimately her equal. She did not hesitate. Her smile utilized those exact 12 facial muscles as she spoke a single affirmative word, a sound that sealed their destinies and concluded a 20-year mathematical equation of debt, guilt, and profound, enduring love.